So I want to say just a few more words about the Urban Land Institute. Thank you, Councilman, for doing that brief introduction. The mission of the Urban Land Institute is to provide leadership in the real estate industry, in the responsible use of land use, and in creating and sustaining thriving communities worldwide. ULI is a membership organization. We have about 37,000 members around the world, most of those being in North America, representing the entire spectrum of the real estate development industry: land use planners, financial disciplines, working in private enterprise, and public service. So, and here's what ULI does. It conducts research, it conducts education, it provides a forum for the industry to share best practices. It writes, edits, and publishes books and magazines. It organizes and conducts meetings. It directs outreach programs. And last but not least, it does advisory service panels like the one we've been engaged in for the last week. Advisory services is one of ULI's key programs. It's been doing it since 1947. It's done 15 to 20 panels a year since that time, over 600 panels all over the world. The focus of the panels, just as it was with this one, is to provide independent, objective, and candid advice on important land use and real estate issues. The process is a simple one. It lasts about 5 days. The panel arrives on a Sunday. We review background materials both before and at the time we arrive. We receive a sponsor presentation. We get a tour of the neighborhood that's the subject, as we did here. We get a chance to talk to local residents during that tour when we're lucky. And for a full day, we conduct stakeholder interviews. In this case, we interviewed over 60 stakeholders over a period of a single day, and I can tell you that the participants of the panel were pretty bleary-eyed, as they always are by the end of that. After that, we spent a couple of days considering the data, framing the issues among ourselves, and writing recommendations, the ones that you're going to see today. And then we make this presentation. Following that presentation, ULI issues a final report that typically follows several weeks after the presentation of the summary. And I want to point out that what you're going to see in this PowerPoint presentation today is merely a summary of the findings. The full details will be provided to you in the report that comes from ULI. Our panelists are experts from all over the United States. Each of them has volunteered. They're not paid. They're volunteered to take a week out of their busy schedules to contribute their knowledge and a considerable amount of effort. Each of them has a real estate expertise directly related to the questions we've been presented. And you're going to hear from each of them in the course of our presentation. In addition to that, ULI staffers Tom Eitler and Catherine Craig have organized and provided stellar support for this panel, both before and during the panel itself. We also want to thank our sponsors, in particular East Liberty Development and Councilman Ricky Burgess, and the supporting companies for their support and for making us feel welcome and at home while we've been here. Everyone at ELDI and the councilman and his staff gave us incredible amounts of time, supplied us with mountains of information, most of which we were able to get through, and were always ready to discuss and answer questions with us. So for this panel, the councilman and ELDI asked us to look at 5 neighborhoods that we'll collectively call the East End neighborhoods. It consists of East Liberty, Lorimer, Homewood, Lincoln, Leamington, Belmar, and East Hills. Our assignment was to consider the series of questions that you see here. I'm not going to read them, but they will be contained in the report. I will say that they're somewhat wide-ranging, as is the geography of this area, as we found out. But all of them revolve around issues of maintaining the character of the community, the essential character of the communities, while trying to maintain affordability, both of the housing stock and of the business stock, and social equity, an environment where there's a lot changing, and changing fairly quickly. And I should also say that while we strive to address the issues in the questions, the panel's free to consider all aspects of any question, or even a question that wasn't brought up at all, to bring up observations and responses that might not have been one of the original questions. And this isn't limited to responding only to these questions. So you will hear us talk about things that may not be direct answers to the questions, but flow from those questions. In other words, we're an independent panel. And so, Pittsburgh. Over the last several decades, Pittsburgh's been buffeted by economic change. On the bad side, it was rocked by the loss of its primary industry. And now, 40 or so years later, on the good side, it's probably a bit surprised by its recent success. Pittsburgh's hot. And so there are two different tales here, but perhaps they're similarly important inflection points. So first, the loss 40 years or so ago. That loss to both Pittsburgh and to the East End communities that we studied was pretty staggering. The city's population was cut in half. It hollowed out entire communities, including communities in the East End. And in the process, it forced a series of very difficult choices on the city. First of all, what to save now and what to save for later. And making decisions about tough cuts in services and in maintenance. And the city's still struggling with the effect of these choices even today. But what the recent successes are doing to Pittsburgh and to the East End communities are equally important. After 50 years, Pittsburgh has finally realized population stabilization and some projected, but probably modest growth coming up in the future. Some communities are rebuilding, including in the East End. And in East Liberty, that rebuilding is happening right now. The other communities, the other 4 communities, see the prospects of rebuilding in the future, in the near future. But this is also forcing some difficult choices, different than the ones that happened during the losses, but still difficult choices. How do you maintain affordability in these communities when they're changing so rapidly? How do you maintain the character of those communities? And there's the fundamental challenge of change, welcoming the new while accommodating the old. But as we found out, Pittsburgh responds to challenges, as they did with Market Square, where they tried and tried again to revitalize that area and found over and over again that it didn't work over a series of years. But they didn't give up, they rolled up their sleeves, and they did it until they got it right. And now it's a model development. That same vision and ability to face difficult choices is going to be called on again to make sure the East End is included in Pittsburgh's success. So here's a fundamental question before we even start, and that is, what does a city that used to be 600,000 people look like when it's 300,000 people? It's a potentially tough choice. In simplest terms, it boils down to, when you have your population, do you cut your area in half, or do you cut your density in half? If these are the only two choices, we on the panel, I think, would opt for density. I think anybody would probably agree that a very healthy, vibrant city of 28 square miles is preferable to a semi-functional, mediocre city of 55 square miles. Now, it doesn't want to be probably as dense as Kowloon Wall City here, but by the same token, we're not talking about turning any part of Pittsburgh back into farmland. So, the challenge, let me back up a step. At the same time, there's a possibility that Pittsburgh could be something different than these two extremes. Maybe it's a city that transforms itself in ways that make it grow again, even if that takes a while, and even if it doesn't mean getting back fully to 600,000 residents. And we think that this more aspirational model is more in Pittsburgh's spirit. So we encourage you to plan for growth, but to do so realistically in terms of numbers, and even more importantly in terms of time frame, but with enough flexibility to make things work when the inevitable next economic buffeting happens. Now, for the East End, the upturn in Pittsburgh's fortunes may represent a once-in-a-generation opportunity, and it's one it should seize. In the process, you need to be mindful of these challenges and issues. There's certainly a tendency and a temptation to strike while the iron's hot, and it's appropriate to do so. But you need to think about doing so with the discipline so that you're not purely being opportunistic, but you're doing it in a planned way. And you have to remember that this is not a sprint. This is a marathon, just as it was in East Liberty. So building for building's sake can lead to poor decisions, because solutions in the East End aren't just about building, they're not just about real estate, they're not even just about housing. They're about building a full spectrum community, which is a big challenge. Secondly, think about the challenges that market and particularly capital market uncertainty presents. Investment capital is fickle. It can go anywhere. And it likes to base investment analysis on historical data. This isn't particularly beneficial to Pittsburgh given its past. And it means that funding sources often aren't good at looking at solutions that are new and different, new approaches, new markets, new ideas. And this means you're going to need to be convinced of the enterprise that you want to undertake in the East End. Thirdly, think about grassroots versus top-down. We realize that Pittsburgh isn't required to have a comprehensive land use plan, but we believe that having one is a good idea. We do know that one's underway. It's been underway for a while, and we also know that there are plans to complete that within the next 2 years. We've also learned that planning initiatives in Pittsburgh tend to be grassroots from the ground up, and that's certainly commendable. We've seen some really impressive neighborhood planning processes here in the last few days. That said, some, maybe many, urban needs and problems transcend neighborhood boundaries. Things like transportation, stormwater management, things like affordability, housing the poor, and diversity, just to name a few. And in fact, the fundamental question I raised above, what kind of a city do you want to be at 300,000, is a question that really needs to be answered comprehensively, not just for the city of Pittsburgh, but also for the region. So a comprehensive plan could help provide a framework for each community to understand its role in each of these larger areas without dictating in a top-down way. But not having a touchstone, we think, makes this job more difficult. Next, racial diversity is an issue here. Pittsburgh is very white, but the East End isn't. This can be a liability or it can be an asset, depending on how Pittsburgh deals with it. If it's viewed as an asset, it can give the East End an advantage. The fact is that studies universally conclude that diverse organizations and communities perform better. Next, you need to try, to whatever extent you can, to combat existing perceptions and to transcend boundaries. It probably won't come as a surprise to you that we on the panel found some of the perceived boundaries in the neighborhoods and between the neighborhoods to be a bit mystifying at times. But this is a district of small neighborhoods, and we understand that. There are some definite, hard physical boundaries between these neighborhoods. But those boundaries, where those don't exist, where they're somewhat arbitrary, and the names associated with them carry baggage that can get in the way. It's hard to get past these embedded ideas, but remember that they don't mean so much to newcomers who don't say, "I'd never live in X neighborhood," until they hear it from a native. Now, immediately contradicting what I just said, coming up in a minute, my colleagues are going to talk about each of the 5 neighborhoods in turn after some discussion of our general observations. As they do, I ask you to listen for these recurring themes. They represent the nub of the questions we were asked and of our recommendations. I'll summarize these now, and I'll talk more about them at the end of the presentation. Quickly, they are these. The neighborhoods are different from each other, and they require different responses. The timeline is a long-term one, and it's sequential. You're not going to do this all at once. You need funding ideas both big and small. And I'm going to tell you that we're not going to talk in great detail about this in the presentation, but the report that ULI issues is going to contain a series of ideas, none of which are going to be new to you, because everything's been tried. But it's going to contain a list of things that you might want to consider here, including some small ideas that we think could have real impact here. Next, ratios in terms of the proportions of types of housing stock ranging from low income through moderate through market rate, and the incentives and the mandates that you use to create those. We have a series of ideas that we will talk about as we go through the presentation. Crime, we've heard some really intriguing experience here, particularly from ELDI, about the experience that they've had with crime reduction and its effect on housing values and development patterns. We will talk more about that through the presentation. We think that's an intriguing idea that bears further study to validate the data that comes from it. Engaging existing residents. We've seen some really promising local examples of this that we'll talk about. And finally, We will give you some recommendations about the HELP initiative, which we find to be a good idea that depends on capacity and organization being convincing. And finally, ELDI's continuing role and transitioning over time.
Good morning, I'm Stephanie Hager. I'm a senior associate at BAE Urban Economics. We are an urban economics and real estate consulting firm located in Berkeley, California. I'm going to give a little bit of background about residential market conditions in Pittsburgh in general, but particularly in the East End. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about housing affordability, because this is a topic that will come up a lot during our discussion today. As a rule of thumb, housing analysts typically consider housing to be affordable when housing costs are equal to no more than 1/3 of the household's total income. To put some numbers to that, in the city of Pittsburgh as a whole, the median income is about $41,000. That means that the affordable sale price for households at that income is about $160,000, and the affordable monthly rent is $1,140. Because the incomes are lower in the East End with a median of about $23,000, the affordable housing sale price for households in that area tends to be closer to $100,000, and the affordable monthly rent tends to be closer to $640 per month. When we use the term affordable housing, that can fall into a few different buckets. So that can consist of housing that has mandated affordability restrictions. Usually that's a case where a project receives a subsidy in exchange for committing to keeping housing affordable for a set period of time. This can also be housing that doesn't have any mandated affordability restrictions, but which, due to certain factors of the project, are just generally more affordable. The rents on rents and sale prices for units of that type can increase as market pressures drive them up. A third type of affordable housing would be units that don't have any mandated affordability restrictions, but which are made affordable through the use of Section 8 housing choice vouchers. And both Pittsburgh and the East End has all three types of these affordable housing. Looking at the Pittsburgh residential market in general, the median home sale price right now is about $142,000, and the average rental rate is about $1,000 per month. Based on the information that we talked about just a minute ago, these housing costs are affordable to households at the median citywide income level, but they are unaffordable to many lower income households, which includes a lot of the households in the East End communities. In the East End residential market, we see median home sale cost of $24,500. While this is a relatively affordable cost, a lot of the homes that sell at this price point require substantial and costly rehabilitation work. We've heard that that cost typically runs about $150,000 per unit. So what that means is that by the time you factor in acquisition costs and the cost to renovate, a lot of these units become unaffordable for many lower income households. It also means that the cost of renovated homes ends up being a lot higher than typical home sale costs in Pittsburgh, but we have seen some recent sales in East Liberty that demonstrate that there is some market support for units that sell at the $380,000 level and possibly a little bit higher. In East Liberty, in the East End, the average rents are approximately $933 per month. However, the cost of the new rental market rate units that have been constructed in East Liberty recently range more in the $900 to $2,600 per month range. So together, what all this information tells us is that in order to attract new market rate development to the East End communities, that will require some market demand from some higher income households. Looking forward, new residential development in Pittsburgh and in the East End will be supported by new household growth in the region and the city. And for the East End in particular, what portion of that growth can be captured within those communities? Potential sources of household growth in the East End include population shifts between neighborhoods in Pittsburgh and shifts of residents from outside of Pittsburgh into the city. These are probably slightly longer term market opportunities that would become more relevant as market conditions change and the perceptions of the communities shift a bit to people who know the area well. Another third potential source of residential unit demand would be citywide and regional population growth. So the city and the region are projected to grow moderately over the next couple of decades, and that provides a potential opportunity for the East End to capture a portion of that growth. That's sort of a near-term opportunity, as people who we've learned during the course of our time here that the neighborhood boundaries in Pittsburgh are very well defined, and this represents an opportunity for people who maybe aren't as bound in by those definitions to explore some new neighborhoods. Projections show that Pittsburgh is going to grow by 29,000 households in the next 2 decades. That growth could be higher if employment projections are, if employment increases beyond what the projections currently show, or if household formation occurs at faster rates than projected. In terms of the share of this growth that could be captured in the East End communities, there's various ways that growth will be distributed throughout the city. In 2010, households in the East End accounted for about 7% of all households in the city. If the East End communities capture that same share of the growth that's projected to occur by 2035, that would mean a total of 2,400 units in the East End by 2035, which averages out to about 120 units per year. This would be a considerable shift from recent trends. As you all know, these neighborhoods have been losing population over the past several decades, and so this would require a concerted effort in order to attract new growth to this area. It's not something that's likely to happen entirely naturally. There is some potential for more units in the near term, because right now you have strong market conditions, at least in the East Liberty submarket. So, over time, the economic cycles will mean that this growth won't occur all at once, and there will probably be moments where it'll occur faster, and then it'll go into slower periods. Right now, East Liberty is the neighborhood within the East End that is most likely to absorb a significant share of that demand. That's where the hot residential market is at this time. To a somewhat lesser extent, Lorimer and Homewood are somewhat positioned to capture a bit of that growth as well, because they're closer into that activity. They have, in some areas, enhanced transit access over some of the other areas that we've been looking at. And it's also worth noting that a portion of the demand for new residential units in these neighborhoods will probably be accounted for by absorption of existing unoccupied properties. We all know that there are a number of vacant properties in the area, and that will mean that some of this demand is met by those properties rather than new construction.